Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a guy we've had on many times. He's an expert in computer science, an expert in the economy. He has a big website, market-ticker.org, but he has basically shut it down all but one article. His last article kind of says it all. It's the rule of law, and I'm going to paraphrase this very long article, which you should go on and read on his site. And if you don't have the rule of law at the top, you sure as heck aren't going to have rule of law at the bottom. I'm talking about Karl Denninger. Karl Denninger, thank you for joining us today from the Panhandle of Florida.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, I mean, I'm saddened because you have and this is millions of people a year went to your site, and a few weeks ago, I started having people pinging me, maybe a month or so ago. People were pinging me saying, "Hey, can you get Karl Denninger on? Explain why he's doing what he's doing." And he's you actually say on your article, which everybody should read, you lay it out. And I just paraphrase it. No rule of law at the top, no rule of law at the bottom. People go crazy. You just said, I'm going to go enjoy the time I have left because you're forecasting violence. Can you explain why you are so pessimistic and why you did what you did with your very popular website, market-ticker.org?
Well, I need to give you a little history on that, Greg. One of the reasons I left the internet industry in the late 1990s was over this exact sort of thing, but it was at a much lower level than what we see today. At the time, the industry was undergoing a great number of changes. The dial-up business was essentially dying simply because faster means of access were becoming available. And there were two competing means out there at the time, DSL and, of course, the nascent cable industry. The cable industry was one I understood very well because I'd done some studies on it and knew that there was no way that at the kind of price point that consumers would absorb that they'd be able to do it without cross-subsidizing the services. The problem, of course, with this is that's illegal because cable TV services are regulated monopoly. There's only one company that brings cable into your house. The DSL companies, on the other hand, were all running around doing the same sort of thing that companies like Facebook are doing today, claiming that they can have infinite forward growth and infinite margin expansion, and that this is going to go on forever. And so they had valuations and the ability to go out and raise money in the debt markets that were based upon fanciful, things that couldn't happen, okay? So the DSL companies, we talked to all of them and came to the conclusion that they were all going to go to zero. And when they did, if we were partnered with one of them, that it would take us down the chute with them because it would be our customers that would lose their service. And, of course, we would be the ones that get blamed. Okay, and if all your customers get cut off, you don't have any revenue and your company dies. And I was not willing to hitch my firm to a company that I knew was going to blow up. The other side of it was that the cable business was one we couldn't get into. We had no other means to get into the last mile into your house. So the only path forward for the firm, because we had no rule of law, was to find somewhere, either become big enough that you could be one of them, or sell to somebody who was. And so those were the paths forward. And that was a big part of what led to my decision to go the way I did. Now, the choice to sell as opposed to, go public and all that was based on other factors. But that was essentially what informed the choice rather than staying independent. We also had incumbent firms in the marketplace, specifically the local exchange carrier, that were doing things that appeared facially to be illegal in terms of price discrimination, and we couldn't get the regulators interested in it. So again, rule of law, if I tried something like that, they would have been all over me. I would have been shut down in an afternoon and probably in handcuffs. And yet, because this was a big company, there was no enforcement of any sort. Now, today we have an entirely different situation, but it's far worse. You take a look at for example, just as a couple of examples, we just had a gentleman down in Miami who was a caretaker for an autistic man who was sitting in the middle of the road and playing with a toy truck. Somebody called the cops, supposedly, and said that someone was thinking about committing suicide and had a gun. The police showed up. The caretaker is in the middle of the road with his hands up, and they shot him.
I saw the video.
Yeah. Now, if you or I pulled a firearm in that situation without seeing a gun in someone's hand, and by the way, there was no gun. Okay, all the autistic guy had was a truck in his hand, which doesn't look like a gun. And we fired, say much less shot somebody, our butt would be in the back of the cop car right now with handcuffs on. We'd be in jail. We would be charged with aggravated assault, and we'd be looking at 20 years due every day because Florida has a law called 1020 life. And if you discharge a firearm and you are not justified in doing so, you do 20 years. And there is no early release, there is no parole, there's none of that nonsense. You're going to jail, period. Okay, this cop is on administrative leave and he's still out roaming streets. Why? So, if you are a black man and you just got pulled over by the police, what is your assumption? All right, do I want to live in a society where the assumption is what Han Solo did in the bar with Greedo? Because he doesn't believe he will get a fair hearing and a fair trial? That's a bad situation, Greg. And the bigger issue, besides, look, I'm not a black guy, all right? So the odds of them deciding to shoot me on a traffic stop are very small.
Actually, according to a recent study, the odds of you being shot on a traffic stop, a white guy, is greater than a black guy. Did you know that? A new Harvard study.
Maybe it is and maybe it's not, but the point, Greg, is this. There shouldn't be a question of whether or not I'm going to get shot on a traffic stop unless I display a gun, okay? And threaten to shoot somebody else, in which case the cops should shoot me. The guy in Minnesota who was shot and killed during a traffic stop, the police officer's attorney came out and said he thought he was a suspect in an armed robbery. There is a protocol for felony stops. If you believe that somebody is a felon, if that was true, if that was really what the officer believed when he went to pull this person over, you don't walk up to the car door. All right? So now we have an attorney lying about what happened. And again, nobody's in jail. But if you or I pulled something like this, we'd be in prison immediately. Now let's take this out of the you're going to die context, because that's the end point. The end point is you end up with a substantial piece of the population that believes that the only way they can find justice, the only way, is to shoot first. And if that happens, we lose our civil society. All right? That is the bad end point that we as a nation are facing the possibility of dealing with. And by the way, we have a presidential candidate who is saying he wants law and order. That is not the rule of law. Law and order is the kind of thing that dictators have set throughout history. And you cannot conflate the two things, because law and order is do what I say or get shot. The rule of law is everybody has to live under the same set of rules. And if you don't, you're going to jail. Okay? But taking this out of the immediate harm to person context, because quite frankly, okay, all of these shootings are bad, all of these deaths are bad, but your odds of being one of the victims is very low. That's just the facts, all right? Yeah, okay, I don't care if there's 100 of them a year. There's 330 million people in the country. Your odds of being one of those people is almost zero. The big problem isn't there. The big problem is economic. I'm an entrepreneur. I've always been an entrepreneur. If I am going to design a piece of software or hardware and solve a problem, I'm going to try to break a ceiling somewhere, which is what entrepreneurship is all about. That's where the economic engine of this country comes from. I have to be reasonably certain that when I do that, if some big company with a big name CEO or some publicly traded firm steals it, that I can sue them. And by the way, if they steal my copyrighted work, that's a crime. C-R-I-M-E. It's a felony at the federal level. You see, every time you go to a movie theater, what do you see on the screen before the theater starts? This is a crime. It's not just a civil suit, it's a crime. When was the last time any of these people have gone to prison? So if I am an entrepreneur, why do I create? I cannot have any assurance that what I create, what I do, will not be robbed wholesale. And if it is robbed wholesale, and the entity that does it is politically powerful or runs a public company, no one's going to go to prison. The best I can do is try to sue it. Will take tens of years. I'll run out of money first. And if I don't, then I'll win. But you know what? Those odds suck. If I do the same thing going the other direction, I do 20 years.
Does this have to do also if you're going to float up to the top? Because we started out with the premise was the top down, and that there's lawlessness. If there's lawlessness at the top, I mean the whole Hillary Clinton, Clinton Cash, the Clinton Foundation, which is now under investigation by the IRS, incidentally, and federal agents, former federal agents, Kallstrom said it was a big criminal conspiracy. Also, the Bush administration, they did all kinds of stuff, weapons of mass destruction that weren't there. I mean, both parties just seem criminal. The bankers are running wild. The shareholders pay the fines. Is that more of the crime at the top that people are upset about? I mean, it's unbelievable crime at the top.
Oh, it's utterly ridiculous. Look, we have 20% of our economy in the form of the healthcare system that is, for all intents and purposes, a criminal syndicate. There is a body of law, 15 United States Code. It's over 100 years old. This is not some new law that was just passed last week, okay? This is a 100-year-old law. It is illegal for any entity with market power to collude with anybody else or to price fix. It is illegal to discriminatorily price commodities of like kind and quantity in the marketplace. That is Robinson-Patman. That is a federal law. Violations of these laws are not civil affairs, they're felonies. You do 10 years for each count. And the fines for corporations that are involved in this are large enough on a per count basis to ruin any company in the United States, irrespective of its size. They are large enough to shut any company down. And they were designed that way on purpose because the only deterrence against bad behavior when you're talking about corporations is if people go to jail or the firm has its charter revoked because it runs out of money. And the reason that is the case is as long as I can simply pay a fine and shift the cost onto the customers, the shareholders, or both, there is no deterrent at all. You look at the pharmaceutical companies, there are several of them that have been caught doing an illegal thing while they are on probation for having done a previous illegal thing. Okay? I did an article a number of years ago where I lifted a chart that one of the major newspapers in the United States had done of the major financial companies in the United States. Essentially every one of them had been charged and pled to at least 3 felonies. Now, if you or I commit 3 felonies, we go away for the rest of our lives. That's 3 strikes and you're out. Well, you can't jail a corporation, but you can revoke their charter, and that's the same thing. 3rd strike, you're out. But when does this ever happen? When does a CEO ever get indicted? When does the members of the board get indicted? The answer is never. And so if you want to be an entrepreneur in this country, what the country has basically said to you is, if you want to run a little bakery, just as long as you don't tell the wrong people you won't make cakes for them, that's fine. The minute you actually try to grab for the brass ring, you have to walk the gauntlet. Because if you do any of the things that those who are larger than you and have big public companies and big CEOs behind them, if you do any of those things, you're going to go to jail until you get to be that size. So you have to find a way to get there without getting arrested. And once you do that, then you can use those very same techniques that are supposed to be prohibited to everybody to stomp on everybody else. I'll give you another example. Well, 2 actually. The
And
bankers.
wait, and I want to just get this in here, interrupt you just for a second. This is why you're so, not be polite, pissed off. Because you see no way that the economy is going to get better, and this much criminality at the top means, the traffic stops become rough. The population at the bottom says, hey, there's no law, so I'll just do. We've already had people say they want the Hillary Clinton defense. I was breaking the law, officer. I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was doing that. Let me off. So you're saying that if this lawlessness will trickle down, just like trickle down economics, and the whole civilization is in for some very rough shape. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the problem with this is that without economic progress, without people having the ability and the promise to get ahead, what do you have left? Okay? Remember, we have this financialized economy where the answer is always infinite compound expansion of something. That's the entire premise of the stock market. Why do you pay any multiple of today's earnings unless tomorrow's earnings will be better? There is no, and this is something that, if this sinks into people's consciousness, the game's over. Because if you cannot entice people to get out there and create the next big thing, to be the next Intel, to be the next Amazon, then everybody swallows everybody until there's nothing left. And if you're all sharks trying to eat each other, there's no progress.
And this is why globalization is so terrible, because they want to make all the big people bigger and not have any little people but plebes.
Well, globalization is, whether it's terrible depends on where you are, okay? If you happen to be a person that is surviving on $1 a day in India, globalization looks pretty good. If you happen to be somebody in the United States that has not had any wage advancement in the last 15 years, and oh, by the way, in terms of purchasing power, with the government running, $700-800 billion deficits in point of fact, or even in the best years, $400-500 billion, so your purchasing power is being destroyed at the same time your wages are not going up. This looks really bad. And there's this little mathematical problem we have with globalization, which is that there's 330 million of us and about 5 billion of everybody else. All right. So you take a look at, for example, just yesterday, Facebook puts their earnings out and the stock goes crazy. Well, nobody bothered to actually read those earnings because the average revenue per user in the United States was about something like $12. All right, now that's on an annual basis. Now that's what they get from advertising that gets aimed at you. The average revenue per user in the rest of the world is like $1.30, a tenth as much. Why? Because they don't have any money. That's why. Okay? So, when you look at the reality of it, the United States, if you are dirt poor in this country, you're better off than 95% of the world's population, even though you're dirt poor in this country. Go over to Zambia or somewhere like that and talk to me about being poor, all right? We are spoiled, and that's not necessarily bad because we've done the work. We have built the industrialized base. The problem is you can't lift up 5 billion people on the back of 300 million. Your back will break.
That's a good one. That's a good one. That's a great point.
You can't do it. And so this is, the idea that and people say, well, but look, your prices are down at Walmart. Well, that's true. But who made the products? And oh, by the way, if the cost of the product is so low because the person who made it got $1.25 a day, where are you going to find the people who will take the $1.25 a day? And the answer is not here, because if you do that, you starve. Our embedded cost of living is also 10 or 15 times higher than it is over there, because you have a tax system. You want to actually get to work? Well, you need a vehicle. You need a vehicle. You got to buy auto insurance. Gee, where am I going to get the money for that? All right. So see, this is the thing: is that go over to India. You can buy $2,000 cars. You could have a $2,000 car here in the United States, except it would be illegal to import it and drive it on the roads because it doesn't meet our standards, and you couldn't insure it. So instead, the car over here is $18,000 for a base model. Seems to be about the same ratio, doesn't it? About 10 to 1.
Very
Funny how that
interesting. Very
works.
interesting.
Yeah, isn't it funny how that works, Greg?
Very interesting.
So you cannot lift up 5 billion people on back of 330 million. What you have to do is let those 5 billion people discover their own way and build their own consumer economy within their own nations so they rise on their own. What we have in this country is a set of laws that are supposed to prevent you from exploiting people. They're only enforced if you're a little guy. If you're a big guy and you do it somewhere where it's not so immediately obvious out here in the in the middle area, it's fine. The problem is if I'm a entrepreneur, I have no way to avail myself of that, and if I try to do it here in the United States, I go to prison.
I want to get back to your dire prediction, and that is we're going to have not just some more robberies and some more break-ins and things like that. You think that the entire civilized world could break down over this? Could you explain what you're thinking, why you think that?
Eventually, all exponential growth forecasts that don't have an end date on them run up against mathematical facts. We have built into our economy a government structure and a so-called social safety net that relies on that infinite forward expansion in order for it to continue to function. I said back in the 1990s, when the healthcare inflation started and the craziness and the lawlessness in that industry began, this was back when I was running my internet company, I said, look, and this was a huge fight I had within my own family because my father was a lifelong Democrat. He believed that he earned he earned these benefits, and by God, he was going to get them all. And I pointed out to him, I said, that little baby crawling around in the carpet, my daughter, who is now an adult, she's screwed. And the reason she's screwed is because of this attitude. The money that has been collected from taxes over the years, you and everybody else in this country have voted to spend on something else. It's gone. It's not there anymore. So you can't spend the same dollar twice. So where do you think you're going to get this from? And the answer, of course, was, well, growth. I said, he was a CPA. I said, you know better than anybody else. Infinite forward expansion on an exponential basis is impossible. This rock that we live on is fixed size mass and has fixed resources. You can't have infinite expansion forever. But where it is coming to the forefront first is in the healthcare area. And Obamacare was an attempt to extend the scam by a few more years because it was starting to collapse back in 2007 and 2008 at the same time that the housing market was coming apart. And this was how they managed to buy themselves another 6-7 years by forcing everybody into it. The problem is now you've made it worse because you've embedded that into the government. You keep hearing people talking about bending the cost curve. There is a inherent lie in this, and that is last year, the expansion in spending on Medicaid went up faster on a percentage basis than the expansion in spending on Medicare. Medicaid is for poor people. Medicare is for old people, irrespective of wealth. If the reason for this explosion in healthcare costs, which is what all the politicians tell you, is that people are getting older and sicker, then you would expect Medicare spending to go up faster than Medicaid. But that's not what's happening. All right? And you can't say, well, that's because of the Obamacare Medicaid expansion, because that happened 5 years ago. That's over. So why is it happening? Because we have a set of policies in this country that says that a company can develop a drug, for example, Sovaldi, charge $85,000 for it in the United States for a course of treatment. The same drug is available in India for $1,000 for the same course of treatment, the same drug. And if you get on a plane, you fly to India, you fill up a suitcase full of it and come back, you're going to prison. And the only thing that you did wrong was trying to cut the price in the U.S. to level it. Well, where I come from, and when I read the law says restraining trade and price fixing are both federal offenses. So, and oh, by the way, if I own something, and if I bought it for cash and it's mine, I own it, shouldn't I be able to dispose of it however I want? So, entrepreneurship is not just about creating things. It's also about arbitrage, Greg. It's about entrepreneurs do this every day. This is why we have efficient markets, because I may find a better way to crack a barrel of oil and make gasoline for less cost. And if I can do that, should the big oil companies be able to stop me by saying it's illegal to do that? That's crazy.
So how fast could this happen? I mean, could we have what's going on? I mean, you're a professional trader. You're a very smart guy. You're an entrepreneur. You've owned and sold businesses for millions of dollars. Do you see? I mean, we've had all these warnings from people like former Pinco Bill Gross and Jeff Gundlach, who manages $100 billion. They're talking about Armageddon and terrible things. Could this whole thing unravel in a hurry? And could that be one of your scenarios? The reason why you want to just go enjoy the time you have? That's what you said on your site. Could this just unravel in a hurry?
Well, that essentially is the reason, Greg, is that I've run the numbers on this. Look, with the expansion that's going on in Medicare and Medicaid alone, during the next president's term, the federal government is going to run out of the ability to fund itself.
So within 4 years, we're toast.
About 5.
Could we have a market? Could Wall Street front run that trade and go, oh my God, we need to get out, because Wall Street loves to front run trades? Could they front run this trade and get out before? I mean, could something happen this fall? Charles Denninger, the great psycho guy, is talking about this is going to blow up in 2017, period, the end. Other people, Catherine Austin Fitts, have said the same thing. Next year, I mean, it may blow up now, but for sure, 2017, the world's going to come calling and going to change this dollar thing. Give us your thoughts on that, on the black swan scenario, so to speak.
Well, Greg, remember in 2007 and 2008, the payment defaults and unemployment that led to a lot of them hadn't started yet. There were 2 little hedge funds that blew up in the summer of 2007 that started the cascade. And then you had Bear Stearns that blew up, and then after that, Lehman Brothers, okay?
Yep.
Lehman Brothers was known by people on the street. This was from the Valukas report. I wrote on this extensively at the time. And by the way, the Valukas report was done by a very well-known law firm in Chicago that I happen to be personally acquainted with. They're good people. They know what they're doing. They're not hacks. They are very, very competent. If they tell you that it's raining outside, grab an umbrella. All right? They documented that multiple people on the street, including Citibank and the Federal Reserve, both knew that Lehman was insolvent and unable to meet its obligations for a fairly extended period of time, several weeks before they blew up. They knew this because Lehman had gone to Citibank and the New York Fed for a tri-party repo, which is, as the name implies, is 3 parties. The New York Fed holds the collateral. That's why it's called tri-party. And Citibank had rejected their collateral. It said, your collateral's trash. What else do you have? And Lehman said, nothing.
So at that moment, they were basically admitted they're insolvent.
At that moment in time, Citibank, whoever the traders were that were engaged in this transaction, knew factually that Lehman was blown up. The New York Fed knew factually that Lehman was blown up. And yet everybody danced and everything's fine, we're all going to be okay, until a few weeks later, it blew up.
Could that be happening with Deutsche Bank now? They make Lehman Brothers look like, I've been saying this, a small, mom and pop bank in Iowa. I love Iowa. But could this be happening with Deutsche Bank right now, that they're basically insolvent as we sit here? Or any variety of other banks? I mean, Santander Bank, the Italian banks. I mean, are all those, is the next big boom going to happen in the banking industry? And do they know it's already insolvent?
Probably, and the problem is this, Greg, it's against the law to trade on material non-public inside information.
Yeah, back to the rule of law. We're back to the rule of law.
And again, nobody went to jail last time, right? How many of these shorts on Lehman were not speculation? They were informed by knowledge. That's illegal. And so, if I think that Lehman's going to blow up and I short them, that's fine. But if I happen to know that they have presented bogus collateral that my company has rejected and I put the same trade on, I ought to go to prison for that because that's material non-public information. Until and unless it's announced that the transaction failed, then it's public and everybody can do whatever they want. But until that happens, I'm trading on material non-public information. That's against the law. So yeah, I think that's a possibility. But here's what everyone needs to keep in mind.
That Lima, you think that Deutsche Bank could take us all down?
Oh, I think
A Deutsche Bank-like bank.
Well, I don't know if Deutsche Bank is necessarily going to take everybody down, but as far as whether or not it's likely they're going to blow up, yeah, I think it's very likely they're going to blow up. I think Deutsche Bank has been in a position where they've essentially been given a shine on with regards to a lot of things in their book for years because they're the pet of the German government. And when you look at the amount of leverage they're carrying in their derivative book, it's absolutely outrageous. So how are all of those not being subjected to reasonable margin requirements? And if they were, how does the company stay in business? It's impossible. So, but here's what everybody needs to take away from this because it's the most important aspect of it. In 2007, 2008, the crash preceded the mathematical wall by a lot. All right? The mathematical wall on the housing cycle was several years out when it all blew up. The market never allows you to get all the way to the theoretical wall because somebody every night wakes up in a cold sweat and gets really nervous. And that's just the way humans are. It happens. And as long as the number of people who wake up in a cold sweat really nervous is outpaced by the number of people who say, that's an opportunity to make money, everything's fine, okay? The day that a critical mass of people wake up in a cold sweat and go, oh my God, that's when it comes apart. And it always happens before you hit the mathematical limits because eventually people figure this out before that happens. It could be a day ahead of time, it could be a month ahead of time, it could be 5 years ahead of time, but it will be ahead of time. And that we have these timelines out there. And the not amusing part of this is that I had a timeline on this in 1997 of 20 years.
2017. Oh my God.
I have when Obama was elected president, and I started with the whole Tea Party thing and the health scam with the Affordable Care Act and everything else and started raising hell about this. I went back and I reran the numbers and said, yeah, we're kind of sort of in the same trajectory. It hasn't really changed much. And now I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, the hard mathematical wall is out somewhere around 2021, 2022, which I mean for 20 years in advance, being off by 4 or 5 really isn't bad. All right. And remember that they've tried to take mitigating steps, but they haven't solved the problem. You could fix this in an afternoon with existing law if we had anybody in the government that cared about such things. You wouldn't have to arrest very many healthcare executives. You'd only have to indict a couple of them because none of these guys are going to go to prison to try to maintain what they're doing. They'll all fold if the alternative is 20 years in the can. The problem with doing it, and the reason that you won't find anybody and by the way, this includes the so-called fringe candidates like Gary Johnson, who I challenged on this point during the last election cycles. One of the reasons I left the Libertarian Party was that he blew me off, basically called me a blowhard, despite being shown the math. And then the state party refused to pick this up as something that they required for endorsements. And I said, look, you cannot endorse a candidate who is putting forward a plan for America, I don't care what office, that does not address the existential threat that will ultimately destroy the economy with mathematical certainty. This is not about, maybe ISIL will come over here and we'll get a dirty bomb and we'll blow it up in New York and oh my God, everybody will die. No, this is not about that. This is about an economic catastrophe that is going to happen.
And this is just healthcare.
Yeah,
forget about everything else, the derivatives, the insolvency, the exploding debt that we've had in the last 8 years. I think we grew the debt in the world by the global GDP, just about. So this is just healthcare, that bomb. Well, couldn't all this come crashing down sooner than 2021? I mean, Couldn't all this come crashing down a lot sooner than anybody thinks?
Oh, sure, it could have. I mean, the tipping point could come tomorrow, for all I know. But what you have to understand is that if you take this industry and you fix it, we would have an economic depression immediately because about 15% GDP would disappear. Now, it wouldn't stay disappeared for very long because those resources would be reallocated into other places in the economy. You would get an immediate 15% improvement in your purchasing power, everybody in the country, rich, poor, everybody alike. And businesses would become anywhere from 15 to 20% more efficient. We would be the business haven of the world among the developed nations.
But
And
that's not going
well,
to happen, though.
we would do it in a day. We would have, however, something that looked kind of like 1920, 21 in terms of trajectory. We would have a horrific crash and then a roaring comeback as that reallocation occurred. 1920, 21, by the way, is the worst in terms of rate of change, depression, that the United States has ever suffered as a country. The only reason nobody pays any attention to it it was over almost before it started. So there's, and yet it gets just a footnote in the history books. By the way, it's kind of interesting who was the Treasury Secretary and who was Secretary of Commerce, and the players and their positions and how that played out a few years later in 1929, 1930. If you really want to sit back and go, what? Go look up the players in the 2021 collapse and what positions they held, and then where they ended up later on and what they did. And you'll just kind of sit there and go, oh my God, here we go again. So yeah, this is basically the thing, is that if you lose the ability of the government to perform its basic functions, and consider what happens if we have this squeeze take place and the government has to choose between cutting off all of these people that need kidney dialysis every week or they're going to die, or they cut off the food stamps and there are riots in all the major cities within 48 hours, right? Go down the list of scenarios and tell me where you find the good ones in this kind of a squeeze fiscally. And if you try to print your way out of it, which is what Japan has done, has it worked? Japan has a stock market. Remember, the Nikkei at its peak was at 40,000. They haven't been anywhere near that since, have they?
Nope, not at all.
All right, and their economy is so overloaded with debt, and the only reason they've gotten away with it is because they've essentially forced everybody into it. But now you have the same kind of situations with people unable to meet the basic needs of life in Japan, and to a large degree they're elderly. So we've got this kind of stress is not just limited to the United States. But yeah, this is a very bad situation, and if we don't cut this out and start looking at the rule of law as meaning something again, I don't see how we get out of it, because the only way out of this box is to stop the lawlessness and then let entrepreneurship come in and find the technological innovations that drive the recovery. But you can't do that if everybody, like myself, who would try to build those kinds of innovations has no reason to do it, because it's just going to be stolen and there's nothing we can do about it when it is.
And last question, you must think this is fairly close, because everybody goes on your website, everybody should go on market-ticker.org and read your article. It's very lengthy. You must think we're very close for you to close your article. I'm going to go spend the time I have left and enjoy myself. We're a lot closer than what you're forecasting, are we not? Aren't we a lot closer? Aren't we one hiccup, one black swan, one suitcase nuke, one sinking of an American ship in the South China Sea or in the Mediterranean? Aren't we closer than 2020? Aren't we a lot closer, at least according to you, because you're going to enjoy the time you have left?
Well, by definition, a black swan is something that you don't foresee and you can't put a timeline on, okay? So I don't know when the event happens. All I know is that within 5 years, most of the things that we consider to be normal within this country are going to change in ways that you're not going to like one little bit. So if the path that we're on does not change, then that's what's going to happen. So whether the amount of time that is left for me to go enjoy is 6 months a year, 2 years, or 5 years. 5 years is not very long. I mean, I've been on this rock for a little over 50. That means that this is about 10%. Well, 10% is a very short period of time if you think about it, Greg. And if I have 10%, I'm going to go enjoy them. I don't need to do this. And for those people who say, but you should, or you have a duty, or you have an obligation, or you're a voice in the wilderness, da 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 da. I say, you know what? I've been doing it for 8 years. Where's the change in the American psyche? Where's the change in the public? Where is the benefit for standing up with a megaphone for 8 years? Starting, I remind you, the very first article was about Washington Mutual paying dividends out of money they didn't actually have. And that the regulators, by the way, that's illegal.
Okay? They went bankrupt.
They went bankrupt, but the regulators did absolutely nothing about it. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, IndyMac.
Oh, yeah.
Backdated deposits. Okay, that's bank fraud. They did it with the knowledge of a guy at OTS, a federal employee, who did the same thing during the S&L crisis. Same guy. And not only did he not go to jail the first time, he didn't go to jail the second time, and neither did any of the executives. So, this has been going on now. I mean, I've been chronicling this now for 8 years. Where and when does it stop? Where is the change? If anything, it's gotten more brazen and worse. Just look at what the FTC said about Herbalife just a couple of weeks ago. They laid out the case. Look, their marketing materials were bogus. They were promising people that they would make their money through their downline, through recruiting more people. That is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. And yet they said they must change this. Well, how about all of the thousands of people who believed this pitch and all the money they lost? What do you do about the ruined people? Why is it against the law? I find it astounding, really, that this kind of stuff goes on in America today. All right, remember, and we had, you've had the dueling hedge fund guys, right? They're out there saying, it's a Ponzi scheme. No, I'm good. Icons on one side, you got the other guys on the other. And the guy who actually got out there and basically got the FTC to look at this, he has lost a few $1 billion trying to get this looked at. If you can't manage to get someone prosecuted with a few $1 billion, what chance do you have?
And you're saying because of a lack of the rule of law, we've signed our death warrant. I mean, the lack of the rule of law means America's toast. Is that
Greg,
right?
Yeah, Greg, there was an episode of Bill Friday. Gannon, Friday. Dragnet. Years ago when I was a kid, black and white episode, you can still find it if you dig around, all right, on TV about exactly this sort of thing. A company that was out there promising people that they would recruit more people and they would get 1% or 2% of everything that they sold. The guy got busted and went to jail. A mathematician got up on the stand and laid out the fact that this was mathematically impossible. Gavel comes down, you're done, you lose, you go to jail. Why do we still have companies doing this today? It was 35 years ago. I watched on black and white television when I was a kid.
The lack of the rule of law means America is doomed. Would you say that?
Yeah, unless we change it. And that has been the focus of the market ticker since it began publication. I avoided the crash because I got out of the business. And the internet bubble was all about fraud. It was all about claiming growth rates and penetrations and profitability that could never happen. Now we've got the same thing going on in the housing bubble, right? Making loans to people that had no money. You've got securities being sold to people that were supposedly good securities, according to the salesman. 5 minutes later, the guy's on an internal conference call and calls it dog squeeze and vomit. All right? He doesn't go to prison for this. It's fraud. He doesn't go to prison. Nobody goes to prison. In fact, nobody went to prison. All right? Now, what do we got going on? We got the same thing going on in myriad sectors of the economy. The entire healthcare system is essentially rife full of this stuff. There's basically nowhere that you don't find it to some extent in healthcare. You've got major public companies that are doing this kind of thing. You have analysts out there that are putting out opinions that are predicated on things that are mathematically impossible. And hey, listen, everything's fine. The housing is back. We get the, gee, your house price is reasonable. Gee, if that price is predicated on me being able to borrow money for 3% for 30 years, what happens when it's 4?
Or 6?
Or 6? By the way, the long-term average outside of serious economic crises, like the inflation thing with Carter and all that, the long-term average on 30-year money is about 6-ish, and that's about where it ought to be.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is that the payment that you can afford is about double what it actually is. So that means the price of the house is about double what it ought to be.
Well, Karl Denninger, everybody's going to miss your voice. That article, your site's going to be up for a while. I hope you get a bug in your saddle and change your mind and put something new up from time to time. Lots of people have contacted me and said, hey, what's going on with Karl Denninger? And I'm sorry that you're so pessimistic, but you've sure laid out a good case as to why. I think we all understand that, my friend. Karl Denninger, thanks so much for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. Really appreciate you coming on.